Welcome to the Legion Strength and Conditioning Podcast. You can check us out at legionsc.com or follow us on Instagram at legion.sc. So often athletes following their program want to know something like, what is the point of this training session? What am I working on? What should I be shooting for? What's a good time on this? Which is a very reasonable series of questions to have, right? I think that a lot of people who are attracted to something like competing in CrossFit, who are attracted to listening to podcasts about competing in CrossFit, sort of have a mindset of achievement. They like measurable results. They like knowing how they're doing. They like improving on things. So this is all a very reasonable and appropriate way to think about training, right? It's like, hey, I want to get better. I want to know what the point of what I'm doing is. I want to execute to the best of my ability. I really want to essentially, do what I'm supposed to do so I can actually get better. So very admirable. But I think that a lot of times this can also be somewhat negative for people, right? That they can get a little bit too in the weeds in terms of thinking about their actual results and training sessions day to day, that they can get a little bit too focused on what the actual point of a specific training session is rather than being able to zoom out and see the big picture of what they're working on. And that this can be a difficult battle for coaches, right? Because we want to we want to help people improve. We want to help people understand what they're working on, but we also want to keep them from getting too wrapped up in day-to-day specifics of what's going on. So this is a constant battle from a coaching perspective to figure out what the right way to communicate is with people. And then from an athlete perspective, it's a constant battle to, focus and do what you're supposed to do without getting caught up and just sort of like spiraling down negative emotional spirals relative to day-to-day results, or just getting confused and missing the bigger picture point and, sort of missing the forest for the trees, as they say. So John, I know that we've talked about this a little bit before. What are your thoughts about this? How do you think that athletes should focus on the things that actually matter, and how they should think about zooming in and zooming out with their training sessions?
Yeah, I think it all depends on the athlete as to how they approach that. Because some people are very focused on the kind of the macro of, I want to achieve this by whatever time. But the people who get caught into the micro details, they're very much results-driven people. So they can do a workout and maybe they hit 5 rounds. They're like, is that good? Is that what I was supposed to hit? And it's like that. For someone like that to be able to let go of the minor details and the understanding that not every workout, not every piece within a program is designed to be analyzed to that degree. Like you could do a Metcon, you could hit 7 rounds, you could hit 6 rounds. That number doesn't necessarily mean anything in the scheme of things. Doing the work is important. Maybe the movements in the workout are important for you to work on in combination or something like that, but the actual result is largely irrelevant. If you blew up and you couldn't finish a round, sure, let's talk about that. If it was so easy that you just couldn't stop moving the whole time and you're worried that you did too much work, which I don't think has ever happened. I think, it does depend on the athlete as to how they approach that. But often getting caught up in the micro details of a day session, like just zooming in on a single day, it just doesn't really have a lot of benefit for an athlete to analyze that much.
Yeah, and I think as well as that sort of for those individuals who are really hyper focused on the details of the program, there can be a little bit that they lose focus of just the process and having to actually just go through training. And getting through sort of the reps and the hours. And I would say that sort of on the other end of the extreme, you have those individuals who are not actually being, objective in how they're structuring their training and not prioritizing what they should be doing and things like that. But, sort of bringing it back to those individuals who are really focused in on the details. I think that training itself, there is a large part of it, which is just exposing yourself to different combinations of movements, practicing your sport in different ways. It's not always about trying to sort of push for a score onto something. A score on something doesn't necessarily tell you. It's not really going to be giving you any indication of like success in competition or anything like that. A lot of it just comes down to accumulating time, practicing reps, getting exposed to different situations, gaining experience. I think that's really important. I think the more that people can really just get focused in on that and thinking about how they can maximize each training piece to the point which is productive, and it's obviously not going to be taking up too much bandwidth, because you don't really want to be putting too much mental energy into certain training pieces when you don't necessarily need to, because that's probably going to fall off somewhere else. But I think that there needs to be a little bit more fluidity and a little bit more flow in terms of how those individuals are practicing. But it's a fine balance, and I think that being objective and having a specific plan and prioritizing is really, really important. But at the same time, there is a bit of it which is you need to practice the sport, you need to get stuck into it. And if there is anything that comes out of that experience which you're confused by, or like you said, John, if you blow up on a certain movement which is a little bit different to what your usual experience is, in those situations, that's where you have to then come in and you have to actually start thinking about it and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, Luke, I really like what you said there about the idea of gaining experience. I think that's a really helpful lens with which to view training sessions, right? That we don't necessarily want to think of each training session as something that needs a score, that needs to be ranked and needs to be, dissected in whatever gory detail to figure out exactly how you performed relative to your expectations, and, build a Gantt chart of your progression over time on a certain, project and training. Like, yeah, it's good to sort of be aware vaguely of that stuff, but we run into this issue with our sport where pretty much everything is trackable, everything is measurable, which from the perspective of, getting people excited and wanting people to participate can be beneficial. But for folks who are participating at a high level, having data attached to absolutely everything like that, I think can be negative, because they aren't viewing things through the lens of trying to build experience, right? That, in other sports and other situations where people are engaging in skill practice, you have an idea of how you're doing on something, but you can't attach a specific metric to every single time you do some soccer drill where you dribble through some cones and like pass the ball, right? You can't attach like a specific metric or a leaderboard to every time you sing some scales and work on diaphragmatic breathing. Like, it's just not something that you can be like, oh, this is where I stand on today's practice session. That, like, yeah, you want to know roughly how you're doing, but people in other sports and other skills are able to practice without this sort of constant ranking of themselves relative to other people, which I think does facilitate them looking at practice more as an activity that they use to gain experience, and as an activity that can be just sort of like inherently pleasurable, rather than work that they need to do to kind of like check off the list for their day and rank themselves.
And I think it's something we've talked about before as well, that, not every day is an optimal training day. If you don't get the right sleep, if your nutrition wasn't right, if you're overly stressed, there's so many variables that can affect your performance, that focusing in on one day's results and focusing in on one workout's results, even if you have improved on that, it doesn't mean your performance is going to come out improved for that day. So there's a lot behind just that kind of focus view on a day's training or on a workout's result or anything like that.
I think sometimes I've noticed as well is that sometimes this very, very hyper-focused behavior can happen, but then it can quite easily fall off as well. I think that, you do have people who are very analytical about things naturally, but then I also think that sometimes it can be a bit of a compensation strategy if, say, for instance, someone is not really paying attention to other areas that they have that they need to fix up to help them with their training and adapt to their training. Or say, for instance, they have gone through a couple of days of unfocused training, and then all of a sudden they're like, all right, Jimmy, I need to fucking, focus in now. So let's be really specific about this Metcon that I'm going to go through today. And it's like, okay, well, you probably need to have a little bit more of a even keel of energy and focus over what you're doing, because otherwise you're going to have this sort of like fluctuation and you're not going to get consistent results. So I think that the being hyper-focused and being analytical is good to do on sort of like this. I would say, like, post-competition, have a look at where you ranked, have a look at the movements that you struggled with, what were the things that were difficult for you, and then figure out, okay, what are the patterns there? Are these things, do they correlate with my training priorities? And if they do, then, okay, I know that I'm moving in the right direction. If they don't, then maybe that's somewhere where we need to like change the plan a little bit, have a rethink of how we do this. And I think that, with individuals that I coach who are a little bit more experienced, when they have that base level experience, they know how these sort of combinations of movements are going to feel. They don't really have too many novel experiences in their training. Training is a little bit more of, competition to competition. Here's the feedback. This is what I felt good in. This is what I didn't feel good in. Generally speaking, their weaknesses are always going to be their weaknesses. So you're always mainly working on the same things, but you're just trying to sort of, make it a little bit more well-rounded bit by bit by just focusing on an area maybe for a training block, for a few progressions. Okay, now I feel a bit more comfortable in that. You go into a competition, you get a better result in that area, and training becomes a little bit more of this, just a little bit less linear in thinking, and a little bit more, okay, we're just going to cycle through similar stuff, but we're going to change it up a little bit to create this, this well-rounded athlete.
Luke, we've talked in the past about Goodhart's Law, which is a management concept that is at least somewhat relevant for a discussion about people sort of zooming in on specific metrics and specific day-to-day training results. So quick summary of the idea of Goodhart's Law is that essentially in a lot of management contexts, you want to come up with some sort of metric that's relevant for the performance of your organization, right? Some people call them KPIs, key performance indicators, OKRs, objectives and key results. You basically want to have some numbers that you can use so you actually know, hey, how are we actually doing? Like, are the things that we're doing actually working? And then not just from a performance perspective, but from an accountability perspective as well. If you give people something that clearly dictates whether or not they're doing a good job, then that can make massive improvements in their performance. Because sometimes they just don't really know, right? That it's really easy for people to kind of get complacent or a little bit confused about what they're prioritizing. And if you're like, hey, we're actually tracking, the percentage of people that we legitimately followed up with after a sales consult, and we have a percentage number for that we review every 2 weeks in our ongoing sales meeting, like that can actually result in pretty significant behavior change, because people, if it's not being specifically tracked like that, they may assume it's not actually that important. They may be like, oh yeah, I'll totally do that, and then just forget. But if they know like, hey, in 5 days, we're going to all sit around and we're going to look at a spreadsheet and it's going to say this percentage of people were followed up with, like, I'm going to actually do it. So having metrics like that is really important, but you run into some issues with unintended consequences when you start introducing specific metrics into complex systems. So the idea of Goodhart's Law is that as soon as a metric becomes a target, it ceases being a useful metric, because people figure out ways to essentially game that specific metric in order to get it to move in the direction that they want that aren't necessarily in alignment with the intended outcome of that metric. So classic example is in Vietnam, right? There was a problem with rats. So a program was created that said, hey, if you bring in a rat tail, you get paid a certain amount, with the assumption that people would, go ahead and kill rats as they saw them, turn in the rat tails, and receive money for doing their job to help reduce the pests that were causing all kinds of problems. However, a bunch of unintended consequences occurred, and instead of just bringing in rat tails, instead of killing rats and bringing in rat tails, people started cutting off the tails from rats and letting them go. So there were a bunch of tailless rats about who were, still engaging in a variety of pest-like behaviors. And several enterprising individuals figured out that they could in fact farm rats and grow more of them and cut off their tails and turn them in, right? So classic example of people figuring out a way to game a metric. And in something like CrossFit, it's difficult to game a metric of whatever 50 strict handstand push-ups for time in a way that goes pretty much exactly in the opposite direction of what you want, like people farming rats to collect money on them. But I think we can see some similar issues where people can get very wrapped up in their specific metrics and say, okay, I need to improve my aerobic capacity and I need to improve my muscle ups. So I'm going to improve my 2K row time and I'm going to improve my 30 muscle ups for time. And they'll focus focus in on those specific metrics and actually potentially make pretty significant gains in their ability on those exact tests, but they do it in a way that doesn't necessarily make them any better at the sport. It might even make them worse, right? Because they're like, great, I'm going to do a bunch of strict gymnastic strength. I'm doing a bunch of, aerobic capacity intervals on the erg, and I'm going to just like nail these two tests. But in a lot of CrossFit scenarios, like we talked about before, the real life testing scenarios are very messy and chaotic, and getting a lot better at rowing 2K and doing 30 muscle ups doesn't necessarily translate past a certain point to doing thrusters, muscle ups, and double unders, right? It's like, okay, there's diminishing returns on that. Like if your 30 muscle ups for time score is 12 minutes, like, yeah, that's got to get better. But, if you're someone who's kind of like a pretty good competitor who's trying to get a little bit better and maybe qualify for some more competitive divisions at sanctionals, if you can do 30 muscle ups for time in under 5 minutes and, your ability in CrossFit workouts with muscle ups isn't fantastic, like, well, okay, if you can do that 30 muscle ups for time in under 5 minutes, but you're absolutely terrible at wall balls, double unders, and muscle ups, like that might not be the limiting factor for you. Yeah, that's not an elite score, but you might actually struggle much more with putting things together in a mixed scenario. And so it's pretty easy for people to get sort of caught up and sort of like good heart their metrics and be like, great, I'm going to improve my 10-minute assault bike test. I'm going to improve my 1 rep max snatch. I'm going to improve my 50 strict handstand push-ups. I'm going to improve my 30 muscle ups, and that they can do all that stuff and they can spend a lot of energy doing those things, but that doesn't actually translate into them getting better at CrossFit in the way that they would like to see based upon their improvement in those specific metrics.
Yeah, I think that is something that is, I think that most people who are involved in competitive CrossFit go through some stage of that where they start to focus in on their training, be a little bit more objective, and then they start to figure out that, okay, that there's just certain things that I can train for which are going to have a potential knock-on effect to my performance in competition, and then that becomes the focus. And we see that quite often with strength, and people just sort of, over prioritizing absolute strength. And the fact that, you've got the 2018 games where everyone did the CrossFit total. So you sort of have that as a training metric and you're like, all right, well, this is what an average games competitor can do. And I remember sort of when regionals was going on, they would always sort of bring out these infographics of avatars of like the regional athlete. And it would be the average height, the average weight, their average scores in accordance to whatever their CrossFit Games profile said. And I think that a lot of the things that people measure within CrossFit as well, you have to understand that these tests as well, they sort of get outdated, and people are comparing Fran times, and it's like, that probably doesn't have much relevance anymore. Like that is obviously going to be an indicator of whether, can you do Fran unbroken? It's like, okay, yes, you can. You're probably going to be in a position that like you're going to be able to perform thrusters and chest to bars and high power output type work pretty well. If you're constantly just trying to improve that as a number, it's like that's not going to help you with something like what was the open workout 19.5, where it was like 33.27. It's like that, isn't it? It has so much more volume and it's completely different. So I think that, there's certain things that you can look for. And Todd, I know you've spoken before about functional volume, and it's like you could potentially have a look at where you would want to fit in the open, where you would want to score. You could look at potentially, what the average amount of volume per, several different movements that you struggle at was. And then you sort of have an idea of how many reps you need to be able to sort of express at intensity to be able to, perform in the area you want to. But at the same time, like, I don't really necessarily think that that's too useful for athletes to do. Like, they've got to be focused in on the work. They've got to be focused in on gaining the experience. Because, if their mind is always to these metrics, there is always, like you said, there's always going to be this tendency to sort of game it. And, the world of competitive fitness is full of people who are very, very strong and, but struggle with repeated heavy barbells in metcons. And it's like, okay, there's, that's definitely something that we see that is probably down to people trying to gain metrics to some degree.
I think what you're saying there about how, like a Fran time isn't necessarily that relevant. I think it's relevant to low end. like kind of like what you were saying, Todd, in that, if you look at the CrossFit total and it's like you being able to beat some of those games athletes doesn't necessarily make you a great athlete. But if you are significantly off all those athletes, then that's definitely something you need to improve. So, things like Fran, if you can do it sub 3 minutes or sub 2:30, it's like, okay, that's a good time. Doesn't mean you're a good athlete. If you can't go sub 4, then that's something you need to work on. So I think kind of one end of the scale, those things are relevant to know if you're bad or not. Doesn't say if you're good, but it tells you if you're bad.
Yeah, totally. And to kind of circle back to the initial question that we were discussing, right? I mean, athletes asking, hey, what's the point of this specific session? I think that sometimes what people are looking for as well is some guidance on how they should actually execute a specific session and what the intention of it is. And athletes may not always ask that in the most skillful way. And especially like we've been talking about, if they're kind of wrapped up in their specific performance on a given session. But I think a lot of times what folks are looking for is something like, hey, is my goal on this to go out hot and then see if I can hang on? Say I have something with the assault bike and then some mixed work. Should I push the pace on the assault bike and see what happens on the mixed work? Should I slow down on the bike so I can do my pull-ups unbroken? Is the goal of something like this for me to have my shoulders blow up and then try to gut it out for the rest of the session? I think a lot of times people are asking a question like sort of like that, but they may not always have the exact understanding or the words to articulate what they're actually thinking about or what they're even looking for from a coach, right? So part of the role of a coach is to sort of figure out, okay, what do you actually mean? What are you thinking about? And the question that you're asking me may be essentially like the incorrect question, right? That you just don't have the knowledge to ask the question in a way that actually makes sense, but you're asking something. And now I need to figure out what you actually are in fact looking for and what would be helpful for me to kind of pass on to you as an athlete. So for you guys, I mean, what do you think about if someone does ask you like, hey, what's the point of this? Or like, what am I working on? Or what muscle group does this target? Or whatever the other kind of standard questions athletes ask are?
I think a lot of the time I will revert back to the overall goals of their current training cycle. So whatever we've kind of talked about previously about what they wanted to shoot for, what they wanted to work on, and what I think is going to be their best area to focus on, more often than not, the overall goal of the program is still going to be relevant in the day-to-day. Maybe it's we're focusing, because as much as we say that focusing on the micro is not necessarily great, there are things where the micro is there for a reason. And it could be that, hey, I want you to work on your muscle ups when you're already fatigued in your shoulders. And that's why we're doing this, double under wall ball muscle up workout. Maybe it's doing max effort sets on gymnastics movements. So, okay, I want you to truly max out and then see how well you recover after 90 seconds and see what you can then reproduce. So on the times where a singular workout is very relevant, the results are very relevant, then I think it's okay to talk about that. It's just not always the case. And if the micro details aren't that relevant, it's more referring back to the macro goal of the program.
Yeah, I think similar to you there, John, like I'll refer back to the training priorities of like the current block or whatever the sort of the phase of training that they're going through. But like for me, I tend to sort of have a bit of a map of like what their season is, and I sort of like, there's a bit of a general idea and picture of what they need to be able to do and when they need to be able to do it. But people's training priorities tend to stay within the same priorities or somewhere thereabouts. There might be some changes here and there, but it tends to be sort of focusing in on those. I would get people to refer to like previous training sessions because there's, in the sort of majority of my programming, there is going to be some either sort of like week to week or every 2 weeks, there's maybe some similar piece that they did before. And I'm, usually saying, okay, well, we want to increase the intensity, we want to increase the volume here, we want to sort of have a similar output. For those people who are more experienced, as you said, John, it becomes a little bit more focused on the micro, where I might be trying to elevate like a certain movement under a very specific condition, to sort of make sure that they are ready for that in a competition, because it might be something they don't feel comfortable with. And then with those individuals who have less training experience, things are a little bit less about the micro, I would say, and a little bit more about gaining experience, but sort of doing so in a balanced way, in a way that is going to be addressing priorities for that individual. But a lot of the time when people are sort of getting into competitive fitness and they want to make a sort of a go at it, I think there is a lot of time that sort of needs to be spent of just playing the sport, practicing the sport, and that isn't anything to sort of take away from the idea of specific programming. You can be specific within it, but you could probably say that it, the level of focus and detail is not necessarily going to be as high as it is for, say, I know, for instance, for some of my more experienced athletes, they have a movement and they're trying to work on it. They work on it 3-4 times a week, and it's, within some form, whether you're probably going to get, a bigger movement selection and a bigger array of things to focus on, and you're just trying to develop good habits and making good decisions, and just, bit by bit making better decisions in training. It's not about getting it perfect straight away, but allowing for those opportunities whereby you can sort of fail a little bit and learn from it. I think that can sometimes be a good learning point for a lot of people. We've all experienced workouts where we absolutely get crushed and we're like, okay, I know exactly what I am not going to do next time. and sometimes that's okay to happen. I think that is part and parcel of training.
Yeah, I like what you guys are saying there, just about the different ways to frame certain training sessions. And I think that part of the role of a coach as well, sort of like I was saying earlier, is if someone is asking questions like that, to help them find the quote unquote right question and to help them reframe things themselves, right? That I think a lot of times when people are asking questions like that, they think that as a coach that we are someone who has, some sort of master plan where there's this linear series of steps that someone needs to go through and execute in order to achieve the desired result. It's like, okay, here's the checklist. You have to do this exact training session and you better get this exact score to show that you're on track. And then once you show that you're on track there, then we can move to this next exact training session and get these exact results. And you better be on track there, or else we're going to have to go back to the previous step. And that it just doesn't actually work that way, right? That a lot of people are wired to think about things in terms of those very linear, specific, step-by-step plans. And if I can try to help athletes reframe things and be like, listen, my goal as a coach, like you were saying, Luke, earlier, is to create scenarios for you to actually maximize your learning and maximize your experience. Like, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a certain scenario based upon what I think you might need to work on that's going to teach you something. And it doesn't mean that you need to get a specific score on it. It doesn't mean that there's like a specific exact point to this training session. The overall goal is, how can we get you to learn as much as possible about your own capabilities and your own performance, and by virtue of going through those different scenarios, actually improve at them. Thanks for listening. While you're here, go ahead and head over to your podcast player, subscribe to the show, give it a rating, give it a review, all that good stuff. You can also go ahead and click through to the show notes where you can find out more about us at legionsc.com, and also follow us on Instagram at legion.sc.